Hey CLF, thanks for joining us again. On today's episode of Questions from the Sermons, we're going to be discussing everything from last Sunday's sermon, and that had everything to do with Hosea. Stay tuned. Well, hey CLF, thanks for joining us on this Questions from the Sermon. It's been a while since we've done one of these, but with a brand new sermon series, we are back at you with just fresh questions, and we're ready to tackle them on. So on today's episode, well, even before that, remember to like and subscribe to our channel. It's going to help us stay up to date, help you stay up to date with everything that's going on with CLF. And our calendar is full.
It's packed.
Not only do we have community groups, we have study groups, we have some D groups, we have a bunch of events coming on down the line, men's breakfasts, ladies' conferences. If there is a, well, let me just say, you don't have an excuse not to be here and find something that fits your calendar. So get on the calendar, get on our website, and like I said, like and subscribe. So, well, let's start off with just an introduction. You know, here we are in a brand new sermon series, Prophets into Exile. Pastor, can you let us know what's the intention, what's your overarching goal when it came to look and studying the minor prophets?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing was just thinking about, you know, the way it looks like the culture kind of is moving a little bit with a little more intentional removal of the Christian voice to the circumference. I started just thinking about the fact that we don't really know how to live in that type of environment in America. I mean, other people do. They live on the outside looking in quite a bit. But we, you know, it feels like that the more that you take a stand for biblical truth, the more your voice is removed from the equation. And so I just started asking, what does it look like to live on the outside? What does it look like for Christians to live in exile, in a sense? Now, like I said Sunday, you know, the glove doesn't fit perfectly because what the children of Israel went through in the minor prophets isn't what we're going through.
Right.
But at the same time, you know, just asking what was God calling his people to, which was repentance. What was exile for, which was for cleansing and for turning them back to their dependence upon God, and this real simplicity of faith. Those are the reasons. I mean, I just think that the last few years have kind of taken out of us as a Christian people. Sure. And I've often wondered if it's because we have our attention on the wrong things. And so that's part of the reason, is just, I think, to dive in to think, what's it like to live on the outside, and what does God expect of us?
Yeah. So can you help us out with just maybe defining some of those things that, you know, I mean, we've used the term, you know, we're no longer at the cool kids table anymore.
Sure.
You know, like, are we talking politics, governments, you know, what are some just, you know, straight up examples of things that we no longer have a voice in?
Well, sadly, part of the reason we don't have much of a voice anymore is because the voices that were speaking for the Christian community were pretty lame. I mean, just being honest, you know, without the use of biblical truth, without the a winsome apologetic about what we believe and why we believe certain things, and also too without the grace to handle it when there was difficulty. Right. And the other piece on it is as conflicted as the culture has become and divided, it almost feels like Christians are fighting with the same type of attitude, instead of trying to find ways that we need to help bring people together. Right. So we come off as angry, we come off as a mob. Right. And so in the areas that I'm specifically talking about, you know, it is areas in education. It's areas in the discussion of politics. It's you know, it's in areas of dealing with law or constitutional law, or having a full, you know, biblical worldview about gender and about sex ethics and all these various things that really matter to our generations to come. Right. Yet we have not, if we have entered the fray, some of us have entered the fray without grace and without truth. And then those that have entered that with grace and truth, because of what's gone before, some have been just been basically pushed to the side. Right. And so that's mainly some of the thoughts around it. You can feel it at work, you know, or you can feel it in school if you're, you know, where you're going. If a conversation comes up about sexual ethics as an example, and you're, you know, Christians are scared to even express their own opinions for fear that this might label them and they might lose their job over an issue like that, even though they wouldn't lose their job for that. Right. but they might get labeled for it.
Sure.
There's a variety of things like that,
Right.
and I think Christians feel that.
Yeah, well, I mean, all those spheres, if you will, that you just said, they're inundated into our everyday lives.
Everyday
You know,
lives.
even I think, the one you hear from a lot of people is, I'm just not into politics,
Yep.
I don't want nothing to do with politics. And yet at the same time, politics is just part of your life, whether
life.
you want it or not.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But I think correct me if I'm wrong, I think what you're saying is, how do we still, how do we conduct ourselves in a world that is kind of coming after us, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and like, it's certainly, then when you do get the opportunity to express yourself, what do you do when it's violent? What do you do when it's aggressive?
Right.
And that's what I've been watching a lot of, especially since 2020, is that it just felt like that Christians were using the same weapons
Sure.
that the world uses. And I think it's important for us to realize that God's placed us in this providential moment by his plan.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of it is for us to be purified in our hearts and then also to be purified in our approach. I think that's a big thing.
Sure.
And so, and what you saw from 2020, really 2016 onward, is Christians making compromises with the world on a variety of levels, and because they just wanted peace, but then those compromises with the world or the enemies of God, they never work out in the long run.
Well, I mean, that's a great segue, talking about compromising with those that disagree with us normally. It's a great segue to get into Hosea. So obviously, this past Sunday, you covered 14 chapters.
Yeah, in one sermon.
In one Sunday. So, like you said, this wasn't a 30,000 feet flyover. We're literally on the moon on this one. Can you give us kind of the overarching theme of the book of Hosea?
Yeah, the overarching theme of the book of Hosea is that God's people are unfaithful to God, but God is continuously faithful to his people. And he's faithful to his promise. He's faithful to his glory. And I think you see that in the picture of Hosea. This faithful husband who marries this woman with some prostitute tendencies. She then leaves the house to go be a prostitute. God tells him to go buy her back and redeem her, and he does. And that is just the story of the people of Israel and God.
Yeah, right.
And this faithful God going after his people. Yet what we saw in that book and in that sermon was that ultimately Israel's failure, if you will, led to the hope of the Gentiles, the hope of those of us who are not Jewish people to become God's people.
Right. This book, we see similarities to, how we are Israel, the church is Israel, if you will. So Israel was, to some degree, Israel was unfaithful, right?
Yep.
It turned to Baal worship. It did, but later on it would worship God and Baal worship at the same time. In what ways do you see us, little church in America being unfaithful to God?
Oh, my word. That's a loaded question. Well, I mean, I think that our, I think we can look at sins of omission, our failure to share the gospel. I think our failure in having faithful marriages. The statistics seem to indicate that, divorce rates are the same in the church as they are out of the church.
Sure.
I think our failure to raise our children with the hope of the gospel in mind, that's kind of a Psalm 78 perspective of passing the generations down with the gospel. I certainly think that we are unfaithful to God with our money. It's an area that doesn't get touched on a lot, but, we always want to know what's the percentage that would be faithful to God or not.
Sure.
And I think it's the wrong question to be asking. The right question to be asking is, because Christ came for us, how should we give in accordance? Which is what Paul would say in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. And then as far as the church in America, I mean, it's hard. I mean, the 2020 election season and the 2016 election season, politics got so spiritualized.
Totally.
In a way that got a little weird. I do believe that Christians should be involved in politics. 100% I think we should be. But I think that we have a tendency to, like I said in Sunday, we have a tendency to overlay the minor prophets and the prophets on top of America and our political system.
Sure.
And I think we have to be careful of that. I think we can idolize leaders. I think we do that pretty well. I think that we put a lot of confidence in our political alliances, believing that those are the ones that are going to save us.
Sure.
And we forget to realize that, no, actually, we have a king that's on a throne right now, and his name is Jesus. That doesn't mean that we're not faithful voters, we're not faithful citizens, and we do the things that God has called us to do. So those are some ways. I mean, certainly you could, you can nail down immorality, you could nail down, there were some that say that the right to life issue, being in America is the church's fault. I don't personally believe that. I think that is the way of a Genesis 3 world, and I think that's the way of a world that's going consistently non-Christian. Now, could the church do better at speaking about those things and dealing with those things? Potentially, I say. But I think it's that way with a lot of social justice issues, racism, sex trafficking, you can name the issue. Because those things exist does not mean it's a failure of the church. It could be. So, I mean, but again, and I'm so myopic in a sense of, I'm not very good about what's the church at large's challenge. I think, what are our challenges? And the ones I listed earlier are kind of our ones that I think to ourselves. I think as a church, these are areas that we need to be thinking about.
So I brought that up because I want to go to the other side of the road here. We have a tendency to say, hey, this is how we're similar, to the Israelites mentioned in Hosea. But how are we different? Hosea 4:1-2 says, there is no faithfulness or steadfast love, and no knowledge of God in the land. There is swearing, lying, murder, steal, and committing adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. We could make the case, you're defining America right there, right? So, if how some would say that definition out of that verse fits America, then how is America different than Israel?
Well, I mean, the main difference is that I think I've mentioned this Sunday, and I mentioned it in our musings this week. Is, God chose Israel of all the nations of the earth to be His own people. They had a national covenant, a physical covenant. That if they obeyed God, there's certain things would happen. If they disobeyed God, certain things would happen.
So incredibly unique.
Totally unique, completely unique. America's not that chosen land, even though some would argue that we are. We're not that chosen land. But I also think that the idea of a national covenant with Israel does create for us a little bit of another category of people. You have the physical descendants of Israel, but you also have the spiritual Israel, people that were in Israel that followed wholeheartedly after God. And that's why Paul would say in Romans 9, not all who are descendants of Israel, are of Israel. There's a spiritual dynamic to that. And I do think that when you get into the New Testament, I think that the fulfillment of that spiritual Israel, if you will, I think is the New Testament church. Now, some would get weird and say, well, that's replacement theology or whatever it may be. And my response to that is potentially yes, but I would see that more as fulfillment stuff. Now, does there seem to be some promises in Romans 11 that one day Israel will turn and they will repent? There sure seems to be some things to that. But you can't neglect what Hosea said about these people. They were unfaithful. You can't neglect that they were exiled from their land because they were unfaithful people, that this national covenant with God was serious. And even as several commentators would say, it's obviously that Hosea was not a murderer, a liar, a thief, or adulterer, but yet he was included to some degree in national Israel because of that. And one of the ways I like to put on it is, even though there's not a national covenant with the church, it's like you have the universal church that is invisible, that God sees that they are His people for all time. And then you have the visible church, which is the local church. Now, inside the local church, there's some that are going to come to church, do all the activities of the church, and not be of the church. Right? Sadly. And so that's the main difference. And especially when you come into America, I mean, what Christians in America have done, some in just speaking generally, have done is they've thrown the prophecies of Hosea or whatever on top of America, because a verse like that defines America or says, look here. I think we could say that about a lot of verses. We could say, well, that verse defines Russia, it defines U.S., it defines Argentina, it defines,
And they did what was right in their own eyes.
They did what's right in their own eyes. And you're like, that defines a lot of nations, right? But to claim that as ours, or that this is what God's going to do because of, you can't do that, because the prophecies were given to Israel for a reason. And they were given to Israel as well, looking forward to the day, as we talked about on Sunday, and we'll talk about more this Sunday. Almost every one of these major themes lands in a New Testament era. We're going to see Joel later this on Sunday. And Joel chapter 2 ends up in the book of Acts, as him saying, let me show you the fulfillment of what Joel was talking about. And I think we see that in these books that we can't miss.
So, you have these books, and if I'm being completely honest, for the past couple years and everything, I'm going, we're kind of doomed, we're done for, and I'm not even speaking about just the results of an election or anything, just seeing just the
COVID stuff and-
the trajectory,
Sure,
of
yeah.
just society in America, if you will. And yet, and yet you have, basically chapters 11 through 14 of Hosea giving hope,
Yeah.
So when it comes to the book of Hosea, how should this book, be portrayed as a book of hope?
Well, I mean, I think ultimately the hope is in the fact that we have a God who's compassionate and full of mercy and willing to receive anyone who would turn and repent and receive them, and he would restore them. We could find our true humanity. We'd find our true genders. We would understand how to operate as true humans in that. And so I think the book of Hosea, even though it's 14 chapters, it's got 6 sections of hope in it, and every one of them are about God restoring something to his people. And I think it's important to realize that, we may live in a darker time than normal.
Sure.
I'd say that. I mean, I think that we get so, again, myopic in America going, things are the darkest they've ever been, and they may be.
Yep.
But comparatively to another place,
Right.
it's still pretty light.
Right. Right. Even modern times.
Even modern
Yeah.
times,
Yeah, right.
absolutely.
Yep.
And so I think that our hope is found in the fact that there's a God in heaven who is still operating through the power of his gospel, and he is still transforming the hearts of men and women,
Yep.
and he is not stopping from doing that. And there's still hope to be for a people, the church,
Yep.
to become what she should be, in turn then sharing the gospel with their neighbors, coworkers, and families and friends, and seeing people repent and turn to Christ,
Yep.
and then be discipled so that people can change.
Right.
I think that there's always that hope.
So, Pastor Dave, one of my favorite verses is Hosea 14, 4 through 5, which says, I will heal their apostasy. I will love them freely, for my anger has turned from them. I will be like the dew to Israel. He shall blossom like the lily. He shall take root like the trees of Lebanon. So as we look at this book as a book of hope, when we look at that verse, what does that say about God?
Well, it just says he's compassionate, he's merciful, he's free to forgive. And, I just think, it's one of the beauties of the gospel is it's a gospel of grace and love, and that God, if we turn to him, he is willing and desirous to forgive us so that we
Yes.
could be his people.
Yes, and quick to do so.
Yeah, he's quick to,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yes,
Absolutely.
and that just makes me want to worship right there.
Yeah.
Very good. So, on this
deal.
note, we have the book of Hosea, and it was awesome. Job well done to do 14 chapters
Hey, good.
in one Sunday.
Yeah, thank you.
And then you alluded to it already. Now we head into the book of Joel.
Yeah.
What are we looking forward to there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean,
So join us
Yeah.
on Sunday.
that's right. Well, I haven't outlined yet what I'm doing. I'll probably have that hopefully, Lord willing, today.
Yep.
I mean, generally what you have is the day of the Lord is a big theme in the book of Joel. Joel never one time details the sin of the people, but he does detail about a locust invasion and about a great army invasion,
Yep.
which some think were similar. Some think that the locusts were a metaphor of the army.
Yeah.
Some think that they're actually
Apache
two.
helicopters
Yeah,
and-
that's
yeah,
right. Some
right.
think that there was actually locusts, and then there's the Assyrian army coming.
Yep.
And then there's this day of the Lord in the future
Yep.
that Joel alludes to. But one of the things that really has stood out to me in the book has been, all of us we're going to face trouble in this world. It's just part of living in this world. And yet how we view God's interaction with our trouble is a big deal. And Joel attributes every category of disaster, if you will, to God's hand. And he sees God involved in all of it, and therefore he feels free to appeal to God to change it, right? And that part has really been intriguing to me, to just think how God is involved.
Right.
You cannot miss that he is the Lord of all of history.
Sure.
And every natural disaster, every things that happen, every issue that goes on, every molecule that moves in the earth, every bird that drops to the ground, every flower that blooms, the God of heaven is involved in all of it.
Sure.
And because he's involved in all of it, then we can, as Joel would tell us, to return to the Lord,
Yeah, right.
to cry out to God, and then to see the future fulfillment of the Spirit of God dwelling with God's people, in God's people, and see that experienced in the book of Acts and in Pentecost, knowing that details that we're now living in the last days, which is remarkable. So that part's really encouraging me. I think just as we talked about last week, just a couple maybe questions for people to be thinking about internally is, in their trial and suffering of life, do they, number one, thank God for the trial? And number two, do they see God in the trial? And number three, do they experience God in the trial? Those would be things I think for people to be thinking about.
Well, it sounds like it's going to be a good one. We all,
I hope.
right. Well, I think every Christian would say that they agree with the sovereignty of God, but that also means not just the things that he puts in place, but also the things that he allows. And that's sometimes a really hard thing to come to grips with.
It's really hard,
so,
especially in a Genesis 3 world.
No kidding, no kidding. Well, CLF, that brings us to an end. And Pastor Dave, thanks for joining us again. It's super helpful to me. I'm sure it's super helpful to everyone else out there. So thanks for joining us, CLF, for tuning in. Once again, if you have questions, please continue to send them in to church@clfroseburg.com. We would love to have more of these sit-downs where we answer those questions. And then, like always, like and subscribe. There's a ton going on at the church. We would love to have you here. So like and subscribe to stay up to date with everything CLF. And on that note, we'll see you guys Sunday.